How did one divine wind almost sink the entire U.S. Navy?
October 25th, 1944. 700 hours. Mabalacat Airfield, the Philippines. The humid morning air is thick with the scent of high-octane fuel and tropical rot. Lieutenant Yukio Seki sits in the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M5, Model 52-0, his knuckles white as they grip the control column. He is not checking his ammunition counters. Today, they are irrelevant. Beneath the belly of his fighter hangs a 250-kilogram bomb, fused not to drop, but to detonate on impact. Seki is 23 years old, a husband and a career officer. He does not look like a fanatic. He looks like a man who has accepted a mathematical certainty. The empire is dying. To his left and right, 4 other young men, the Shikishima Squadron, wait for the signal. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man who conceived this desperate gambit, he watches from the edge of the strip. He knows the statistics. Conventional Japanese bombing runs are being shredded by the Marianas Turkey Shoot and the relentless wall of American anti-aircraft fire. The only way to ensure a hit is to stay with the weapon until the very end. The engine roars to life, a rhythmic mechanical scream that vibrates through Seki's spine. He pulls a white hachimaki headband tight across his forehead, the rising sun centered over his brow. I am not going for the sake of the emperor, Seki had told a reporter days earlier in a moment of hushed, dangerous honesty. I am going because I was ordered to. The Zeros bounce down the uneven dirt runway, struggling under the weight of their lethal cargo. As the wheels leave the ground, the transition is final. There is no landing gear cycle for Seki. There is only the horizon and the American masts waiting beyond it. The strategy of despair. By late 1944, the Pacific Theater had become a slaughterhouse for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The loss of 4 carriers at Midway was a wound that never healed, and the subsequent Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had effectively erased Japan's veteran pilot pool. The Americans were no longer just winning, they were industrializing victory. The Tokotai, the special attack units, were born from this vacuum of options. The name Kamikaze, divine wind, was a reach into the deep well of Japanese mythology, evoking the 13th century typhoons that scattered the invading Mongol hordes of Kublai Khan. The High Command wasn't just looking for a tactical advantage. They were praying for a miracle. In the ready rooms, the rhetoric was steeped in Bushido, and the pilots were told they were gods without earthly desires. But the reality was more grounded and more tragic. The volunteers were often the brightest of their generation. University students in the liberal arts, exempted until now, suddenly thrust into cockpits with barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. As Seki's squadron climbs toward the Leyte Gulf, they aren't looking for a dogfight. They are looking for the flat tops. They fly low, skimming the whitecaps of the Pacific to stay beneath the sweeping electronic eyes of American radar. The sea is a blur of sapphire and foam, a beautiful backdrop for the end of the world. Suddenly, the horizon breaks. Gray silhouettes emerge from the haze. The Taffy 3 escort carrier group. The Americans, unaware that the rules of engagement have just changed forever, and begin to put up a screen of 40mm Bofors fire. Seki pushes the stick forward. The dive begins. April 12th, 1945. 14:30 hours. 60 miles off the coast of Okinawa. The cockpit of the MXY-7 Ohka is a claustrophobic steel coffin. Petty Officer Second Class Mitsuo Higo feels the violent vibration of the Mitsubishi G4M. Betty mother plane as it groans under the weight of his rocket glider. He is bolted into the belly of the larger bomber, suspended in the slipstream. The Ohka, ironically named Cherry Blossom, is a purpose-built weapon of slaughter. It has no landing gear. It has no defensive armament. It is essentially a 2,600-pound trinitroanisole warhead with plywood wings and 3 solid fuel rockets in the tail. Target in sight. The bomber pilot crackles over the intercom. Carrier identified. Range 20 miles. Higo takes a final breath of the thin, freezing air. He pulls the release lever. There is a sickening mechanical clunk, and suddenly, the roar of the Betty's engines vanishes, replaced by the terrifying whistle of the wind. He is falling. He counts to 3 and slams the ignition switches. Whoosh! The 3 rockets kick Higo into his seat with a G-force that turns his vision into a gray tunnel. The Ohka accelerates to over 500 miles per hour. Below him, the U.S. Navy's picket line, a defensive ring of destroyers, opens up with every gun they have. The sky becomes a lethal garden of black flak bursts and tracer fire. To the American sailors on the USS Manert El Abele, the Ohka is a baka bomb, idiot bomb. They see a streak of silver-gray lightning plunging from the clouds at an angle no conventional aircraft could sustain. Higo ignores the tracers streaking past his canopy. He focuses on the massive island of a carrier, the deck crowded with Hellcats. He is the pilot, but he is also the bullet. The evolution of the suicide craft. As the war progressed toward the Japanese home islands, the special attack strategy evolved from a desperate improvisation into a massive industrial effort. It was no longer just about the Mitsubishi Zero. The Imperial Air Force began stripping everything that could fly. Biplane trainers, outdated D-3A Val dive bombers, and even twin-engine Francis bombers for the Tokotai. The Ohka represented the technological peak of this madness. While the Americans were perfecting the proximity fuse, a radar-guided shell that exploded near a plane without needing a direct hit. The Japanese were betting everything on the human brain's ability to navigate through a storm of lead. Training for these missions was brutal and brief. Pilots were taught terminal guidance, the art of the final dive. They were instructed to aim for the base of the ship's bridge or the elevator on a carrier deck to cause maximum structural damage. They practiced in gliders, landing on grass fields to simulate the finality of their mission. But it wasn't just the hardware. It was the psychological conditioning. At bases like Kanoya and Chiran, young men were kept in a state of hyper-spiritualized isolation. They were fed the best rations, often steak and sake, while the rest of the nation starved. They were treated as living gods, a status that made the prospect of backing out socially and psychologically impossible. Back in the sky over Okinawa, the sheer scale of the campaign was staggering. In under Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, Japan launched waves of hundreds of planes at a time. The goal was to saturate American defenses. Even if 90% were shot down, the remaining 10% would be enough to break the back of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Higo's rocket burns out. The silence returns, louder than the engines. He is now a silent, high-speed glider, adjusting his trim tabs with steady hands. The hull of the destroyer looms large, the 5-inch guns tracking his descent. He screams a final banzai into the empty cockpit, not out of hate, but out of a desperate need to fill the void before the impact. May 11th, 1945, 10 o'clock hours, the flight deck of the USS Bunker Hill. The sky over the Philippine Sea is a deceptively peaceful azure until the radar operators begin to shout. 2 Mitsubishi Zeke fighters have dropped out of the low cloud cover, banking steeply. On the flight deck of the Bunker Hill, crewmen are frantically fueling and rearming Hellcats for the next sortie. The ship is a tinderbox. "Action starboard! Action starboard!" the ship's intercom bellows. The first Kamikaze strikes near the island, its 550-pound bomb piercing the flight deck and exploding in the gallery below. Gasoline vapor ignites instantly. Less than 30 seconds later, the second plane, piloted by Ensign Seizo Yasunori, emerges from the smoke of the first. He ignores the frantic fire of the 20mm Oerlikons and plunges straight into the center of the parked aircraft. A pillar of fire rises 400 feet into the air. Men are blown overboard by the overpressure. Others are turned into human torches by the raining napalm of ruptured fuel tanks. In minutes, one of the most powerful warships in the American arsenal is a floating charnel house, losing 346 men in a single afternoon. The psychology of the last letter. While the American sailors saw only faceless fanatics and suicidal maniacs, the reality inside the Japanese barracks was a complex tapestry of grief and coerced honor. In the final nights before a mission, pilots were often given a final meal and encouraged to write their farewells. These last letters home are among the most haunting documents of the war, and they rarely contain the bloodthirsty rhetoric of the high command. Instead, they are filled with mundane concerns and devastating poignancy. "Dear Mother, please do not grieve. It is a great honor. Please take care of my younger brothers. I hope the cherry blossoms are beautiful this year in our village." The Bushido Code, once the ethical framework of the samurai, had been weaponized by the state. It was no longer about a personal quest for honor, but a mandatory sacrifice for a god-emperor most pilots had never seen. The social pressure, the geary burden of obligation, was so immense that to refuse a volunteer mission was to condemn one's family to eternal shame. In the barracks, the pilots would often cut locks of their hair and clip their fingernails, placing them in small wooden boxes to be sent to their parents. And these were the only remains that would ever return home. They drank a final cup of water, or sake, a ritual known as Mizu no Sakazuki, symbolizing a parting that knows no return. The tragedy lay in the demographic. By 1945, the Imperial Navy was burning through its human bullets so fast that they began recruiting 17-year-olds from the Flight Juvenile Navy Apprentice Pilot Program. These boys, barely old enough to shave, were sent to die in obsolete machines against a technical juggernaut they could not possibly hope to stop. Despite the horrific damage dealt to ships like the Bunker Hill, the tide was not turning. The U.S. Navy was learning. They developed the Big Blue Blanket, a continuous overhead patrol of fighters, and the Combat Information Center, CIC, to coordinate interceptions. The divine wind was being dissipated by the sheer friction of American industrial and tactical adaptation. August 15th, 1945. 1600 hours. Oita Airfield, Kyushu. The radio broadcast of the Emperor's voice, the Gyokuan Hoso, has just finished. For the first time in history, the Japanese people have heard the voice of the crane announcing the unthinkable: surrender. The war is over. But for Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the commander of the 5th Air Fleet, the war cannot end with a signature on a document. He has sent thousands of young men to their deaths in the name of the Tokutai. To survive them is a dishonor he cannot endure. Ugaki strips the insignia of rank from his uniform, keeping only his dark green flight suit and a short sword given to him by Admiral Yamamoto. He walks toward a group of 4 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers warming up on the tarmac. I am going to make one last mission to Okinawa, he tells his subordinates. Those who wish to follow me, fall in. Despite the official ceasefire, 11 planes scramble to join him. It is a final, unauthorized act of defiance, a funeral procession in the sky. As the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, painting the East China Sea in shades of bruised purple and gold, Ugaki sends his final radio message. I alone am to blame for our failure to defend the homeland and destroy the arrogant enemy. I will proceed to Okinawa, where my men have fallen like cherry blossoms, and ram into the arrogant American ships. Military effectiveness versus the human cost. When the smoke finally cleared from the waters of Okinawa and Leyte Gulf, the cold mathematics of the Kamikaze campaign were revealed. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots had sacrificed themselves, and the damage they inflicted was the most severe the U.S. Navy had ever sustained in its history. Over 400 ships were hit, 34 were sunk, and hundreds were damaged so badly they never saw action again. At Okinawa alone, the Divine Wind accounted for nearly 5,000 American sailors killed in action, the highest casualty rate for any single campaign in the Navy's annals. Yet, strategically, the program was a failure. It did not stop a single invasion. It did not sink a single heavy fleet carrier. The American industrial machine simply outpaced the destruction. For every ship damaged, 2 more were launched from the shipyards of California and Virginia. The Kamikaze was a tactical nightmare, but a strategic irrelevance. The echoes of Chiran today, in the quiet town of Chiran on the southern tip of Kyushu, where the Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots stands where one of the main departure airfields once was. Inside, there are no displays of military triumph. Instead, there are rows upon rows of photographs. Young faces, some smiling, some stern, all now frozen in their early 20s. The legacy of the Tokotai shifted in the post-war consciousness from one of glorious death to one of great tragedy. The survivors, those who were grounded by mechanical failure or who were still waiting for their missions when the surrender came, lived the rest of their lives under the shadow of survivors' guilt. The Kamikaze remains a somber case study in the power of state-sponsored extremism and the distortion of ancient cultural values. It stands as a reminder of a time when a nation, backed into a corner, asked its brightest youth to become the very weapons they wielded. And how those young men, caught between love for their families and a distorted sense of duty, flew into the silence of history,